The announcement did not come through diplomatic channels. It did not come with a press conference, a prepared statement, or the careful choreography that governments use when they want the world to understand that what is happening is controlled and deliberate. It came through a single post published at 2:17 in the morning that contained 94 words and functionally ended the strategic relationship that had defined Western security for 76 years. By the time the NATO Secretary General was reached for comment, his communications team had already been fielding calls for 41 minutes from defense ministries across Europe that were asking the same question in 8 different languages. Not, what does this mean? They knew what it meant. They were asking, what do we do now? And nobody had an answer. To understand what happened in the hours after Trump's announcement, you have to understand what NATO actually is beneath the summit photographs, the collective defense declarations, and the carefully worded communiques that alliance spokespersons release when the internal reality is too unstable to be spoken plainly. NATO is not a military, it is a promise. And like all promises, its value is not located in the words that constitute it, but in the credibility of the party making it. The moment that credibility becomes questionable, the entire architecture built on top of it does not weaken gradually. It collapses in the way that load-bearing structures always collapse, all at once, faster than anyone watching from the outside believed possible until it was already done. Trump had been signaling this for months, not in the ambiguous, deniable way that allows allied governments to tell their publics that the relationship is fundamentally sound and the noise is political theater. He had been signaling it with the specific precision of a man who had already made the decision internally and was now preparing the public record for what was coming. The 5% GDP defense spending demand was not a negotiating position. People inside the alliance who treated it as one, who assumed that the familiar mechanisms of allied consultation and mutual accommodation would eventually produce a number that Washington could accept and Brussels could defend to their public, had misread the man in the Oval Office in a way that was about to cost them everything. The announcement itself targeted Article 5, the collective defense clause that has functioned since 1949 as the foundational guarantee of the entire alliance. Not by withdrawing from it formally, because formal withdrawal carries legal timelines and congressional complications that create room for the kind of institutional resistance Trump had learned to preempt. He targeted it by making its application conditional. The statement, those 94 words published in the early hours of a Tuesday morning, declared that American military response to any attack on a NATO member state would henceforth be contingent on that member state having met its financial obligations to the alliance in full for a minimum of 3 consecutive years. The conditionality was precise, verifiable, and devastating. 14 of NATO's 32 member states had not met the 2% GDP defense spending threshold for 3 consecutive years. Several of them, including some of the alliance's founding members, had not met it at all in the preceding decade. Under the framework Trump had just unilaterally imposed, the American Security Guarantee, the guarantee that every strategic calculation in Europe had treated as unconditional since the Berlin airlift, was now suspended for the majority of the alliance's membership. Not revoked, suspended, which was a different and, in many ways, more destabilizing condition, because suspension introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is what adversaries exploit. The reaction inside NATO headquarters in Brussels was not the organized, process-driven crisis response that the alliance's considerable institutional machinery exists to produce. It was the specific chaos of an organization whose foundational assumption had just been publicly invalidated by the government that created it. Senior officials who had spent careers navigating the alliance's internal politics, managing the friction between American strategic preferences and European political constraints, absorbing Washington's frustrations and translating them into language that preserved the appearance of unity, were now being asked to manage something their institutional experience had not prepared them for. Not a dispute, a rupture. The Secretary General convened an emergency session of the North Atlantic Council within 3 hours of the announcement. The session was classified at the highest level available to the alliance. What leaked from it, anyway, described an atmosphere that one attendee characterized not as alarmed, but as arithmetically honest. The members present were doing the math, and the math was not producing reassuring results. Germany's defense budget, despite the historic Zeitenwende Declaration and the $100 billion special fund, announced with considerable political ceremony in 2022, had still not reached consistent 2% GDP compliance in a way that would satisfy the 3-year consecutive threshold Trump had just established. France met the threshold, but had spent years maintaining that its independent nuclear deterrent represented a contribution to European security that should be weighted differently than raw defense spending percentages, an argument Washington had never formally accepted and had now rendered irrelevant by simply changing the rules unilaterally. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the members who had spent years warning that the alliance was underinvesting in the eastern flank, and who had themselves maintained above-threshold defense spending precisely because they understood the geography of their exposure, met the criteria. But their combined military capacity, without American backing, was not a deterrent to the threat they faced. It was a provocation with no means of defense behind it. The financial markets moved before the diplomatic cables did. The euro fell 2.3% in the first 90 minutes of European trading. Defense stocks across the continent surged in the particular way that markets telegraph fear rather than opportunity. Investors pricing in not the profit potential of a rearmament cycle, but the existential urgency of governments that had just discovered they had no choice. European sovereign bond spreads began widening at 8:42 in the morning, Frankfurt time. By midday, 3 of the continent's largest institutional asset managers had quietly begun reducing their exposure to the debt of member states that fell outside Trump's new compliance threshold. And in Moscow, where the announcement had been received and processed by people whose professional function was to identify and exploit exactly this category of Western institutional fracture, the response was not a statement. It was a movement. Satellite imagery acquired by 3 separate European intelligence services in the 6 hours following Trump's post showed Russian armored units near the Belarusian border conducting what Russian Defense Ministry spokespersons would later describe as a routine readiness exercise. The timing was not a coincidence. It was a message delivered not in words, but in the language that military professionals across the alliance understood with a clarity that no diplomatic communique could match. The question being asked in every defense ministry, from Tallinn to Lisbon, was not whether the alliance could survive this politically. Politics could be managed, messages could be recalibrated, summits could be convened to produce the appearance of unity even when the substance had been compromised. The question being asked was harder and more specific. If Article 5 was now conditional, and if the condition had just been made public in a way that every adversary of every NATO member could read and analyze and build operational planning around, then what exactly was the deterrent value of the guarantee that remained? And if that deterrent value had been compromised, how long before someone decided to test it? The answer to that question was already being shaped in a city that had not been invited to the North Atlantic Council session, had not been consulted before the announcement, and had been watching the fractures inside Western institutions accumulate for years with the patient attention of a government that understood that the most powerful weapon in its arsenal was not a missile system or a cyber capability. It was time, and time after Trump's 94-word post had just shifted decisively in its favor. What happened next inside the alliance would either prove that the institution was capable of adapting to a world in which American commitment was conditional, or it would confirm what Moscow had been calculating for a decade, that NATO without unconditional American will was not an alliance. It was a list of targets with a logo. The emergency phone calls between European heads of government that followed the North Atlantic Council session were not recorded in any official transcript that has been made public. What is known about their content comes from the same overlapping network of sources that produced the council leak. People close to the conversations who understood that history was being made in real time and that the historical record would eventually require witnesses. What those sources describe is not the coordinated, strategically coherent response of an alliance recalibrating under pressure. It is the sound of governments discovering simultaneously that the contingency plans they had quietly maintained for exactly this scenario were not plans at all. They were assumptions dressed in the language of planning. And assumptions, when the moment they were designed to address finally arrives, have a way of dissolving on contact with reality. Friedrich Merz spoke to Emmanuel Macron at 9:14 in the morning, Berlin time. The call lasted 22 minutes. By the standards of the relationship between the two governments, which had spent years performing the choreography of Franco-German leadership while quietly disagreeing on almost every substantive question of European strategic direction, 22 minutes was enough time to establish one thing with clarity. France and Germany were not going to respond to this crisis from the same position. Macron had spent his presidency constructing an argument for European strategic autonomy that was, in many respects philosophically aligned with what Trump had just forced upon the continent. The difference was that Macron had envisioned this transition happening on European terms, at a European pace, with American blessing rather than American abandonment. What Trump had done was hand him the outcome he had argued for while removing every condition that made that outcome manageable. Merz was operating under a different and more immediate pressure. The German public had not been prepared for this. The political consensus that had governed German strategic thinking since the end of the Second World War, the consensus that treated American military protection as a permanent and unconditional feature of the international order, had never been seriously challenged in public discourse in a way that allowed German voters to develop a considered view of the alternatives. They were now being asked to absorb, without preparation and without warning, the information that the security architecture their country had depended on for 8 decades had just been made conditional by a 94-word social media post. The polling data that Merz's political team was already pulling together in the hours after the announcement showed a public that was not angry in a productive, mobilizing way. It was frightened in the way that produces political instability. And political instability in Germany's fractured coalition environment was a threat Merz could not afford to absorb on top of everything else. The conversation that mattered more, the one whose outcome would do more to determine Europe's actual trajectory than any summit declaration or alliance communique, was not between Merz and Macron. It was between Merz and his own finance ministry. Because the question at the center of everything Europe now faced was not strategic in the abstract sense. It was financial in the very concrete sense. Rebuilding European defense capacity to a level that could substitute meaningfully for American commitment would require spending on a scale that had no precedent in the post-war European fiscal order. Estimates prepared by the German Defense Ministry and shared internally with the Chancellery put the figure for Germany alone at $400 billion over 10 years to reach a genuine, independent deterrence capability. $400 billion in an economy already contracting, already running a structural deficit that was bumping against the constitutional debt brake that German fiscal conservatives had spent decades treating as sacred, already facing the industrial decline of its automotive and manufacturing base that had been underway for years and had accelerated sharply since 2022. The debt brake conversation inside the Chancellery that morning was not a policy discussion. It was a reckoning. Meanwhile, on the eastern edge of the alliance, the governments that had the most to lose from the collapse of unconditional American commitment were moving with a speed and a pragmatism that the larger Western members had not yet located. Poland, which had been building its defense capacity at a pace that embarrassed its Western partners for 3 years, which had signed bilateral arms agreements with the United States, South Korea, and the United Kingdom in a deliberate strategy of defense diversification, was already on the phone with Washington, not through NATO channels, but bilaterally, directly. The Baltic states were doing the same. Estonia's defense minister released a statement at 11 in the morning that was notable not for what it said about NATO, but for what it did not say. It did not invoke collective defense. It did not call for alliance solidarity. It announced that Estonia was immediately activating emergency defense procurement protocols and requested urgent bilateral consultations with London, Warsaw, and Stockholm. The architecture being built in real time along NATO's eastern flank was not an alliance architecture. It was a coalition of the willing and the geographically exposed. And it was in this fracturing that Ursula von der Leyen made the move that would define her legacy in ways she had not intended and could not control. What she announced from the Commission podium at 1:47 in the afternoon was a European Defense Union, a fully integrated continental security architecture funded through joint European debt, governed from Brussels, and explicitly designed to replace the American security guarantee with an institutional framework that placed the Commission at the center of European military decision-making. The Eastern members heard the proposal and understood immediately what it meant in practice. Poland would not transfer command authority over its armed forces to any supranational body. Hungary echoed it. Italy signaled the same direction. The Commission's defense union was dead before the podium microphone had been switched off, but the damage it caused in dying was not nothing. Because the governments that had just publicly refused to participate in von der Leyen's framework had also just publicly demonstrated to Moscow that Europe could not agree on a collective response even when the threat was standing at the door. The Kremlin did not need to fire a shot. Europe had just told it everything it needed to know. And somewhere in the silence that followed, the clock that really mattered had already started.